In the grand mosaic of Indian history, few rulers stand out for their sharp intellect and unmatched administrative discipline as Sultan Alauddin Khilji. When people speak of him, they often remember his conquests, his wars in Gujarat, Ranthambore, Chittor, and the Deccan, his victory over the Mongols who threatened to storm the gates of Delhi. But beyond the sword and battlefield, there was another side to Alauddin, the economist, the reformer, the ruler who reshaped the very structure of the Delhi Sultanate. His economic and administrative reforms not only strengthened his empire, but also laid the foundation for stability that outlasted his own reign. His story is not just about power and expansion. It is about how a single man's discipline, vision, and iron will turn chaos into order. When Alauddin Khilji ascended the throne in 1296 CE, Delhi was a city of ambition and fear. The Mongols from Central Asia had already made several incursions into the northern plains, leaving destruction in their wake. Within the empire, nobles and governors were growing increasingly independent. Corruption had seeped into the system, prices were unstable, and the treasury was often strained by continuous warfare. Alauddin knew that to rule such a turbulent land, mere military strength would not be enough. He needed control over wealth, over people, over every grain that moved within his dominion. His reign, therefore, became not only a story of expansion, but of strict governance. The first principle of Alauddin's administration was simple: to create an empire so disciplined that rebellion would become impossible. He believed that disorder was born from greed, and greed in turn was born from wealth. So he began by curbing the economic freedom of the nobility, the merchants, and even common citizens. It may sound harsh, but in his mind, this was not oppression, it was order. He once said that kingship could not be maintained without absolute power, and power could not exist without control over wealth and food. To achieve this, he began a series of reforms that historians later described as among the most ambitious in medieval India. His most famous measures were the price control reforms, a system so detailed and extensive that even modern economists study it with admiration. Before his time, markets in Delhi were unpredictable. Prices of food and goods rose and fell wildly, depending on harvests, hoarding, and trade routes. Traders and merchants often exploited shortages to make huge profits, while ordinary citizens suffered. Alauddin saw this as a threat not just to his people, but to his state, because when prices rose, soldiers demanded higher wages, and when soldiers demanded more, the treasury weakened. So he did something remarkable. He fixed the prices of all essential commodities, from grains and vegetables to horses and slaves. No one could sell above the state-decreed rate. Wheat, rice, barley, salt, sugar, ghee, and oil all had fixed prices. Even clothes, horses, and arms were standardized. To enforce these rates, he established a network of market controllers known as Shahana-i-Mandi, who ensured that no trader dared cheat the public or the state. Markets were organized into three categories: one for food grains, one for clothes and luxuries, and one for horses, slaves, and cattle. But how could he ensure that traders would comply? This is where his brilliance and severity truly showed. Alauddin created an intelligence system so vast that nothing escaped his notice. Every transaction in the marketplace was watched. Informers roamed the bazaars, disguised as ordinary men, listening and reporting every rumor, every violation. Anyone found guilty of cheating or hoarding was punished severely, sometimes flogged, sometimes imprisoned, sometimes stripped of property. The result was astonishing. Prices stabilized across the empire, food became affordable, and the army could be maintained at lower wages. To ensure the success of these reforms, Alauddin also took steps to control supply. He established large state granaries where surplus grains were stored during times of plenty. In times of scarcity, the stored grain was released to the market to prevent inflation. He also improved transportation networks between rural areas and the capital so that food could flow freely and quickly. Traders could no longer manipulate prices by restricting supply. Some chroniclers, like the famous historian Ziauddin Barani, recorded that the prices fixed by Alauddin remained stable for years. Wheat could be bought at 7.5 jatals per mond, meat for 5 jatals, sugar for 1.5 jatals, and ghee for 5 jatals. These rates, Barani says, remained unchanged even during times of drought, a remarkable achievement in an age without modern economic tools. But Alauddin's reforms did not stop with the markets. He also sought to control land revenue, the main source of income for the Sultanate. The countryside was divided into administrative units, each governed by officers responsible for collecting taxes. To ensure fairness, Alauddin ordered a land survey of the Doab region between the Ganges and Yamuna, the most fertile part of his empire. Based on this survey, he fixed taxes not arbitrarily, but according to the fertility of the soil and the quality of crops. Typically, the state demanded 1/2 of the produce as tax, a high rate by modern standards, but not unusual in medieval times. To prevent corruption among revenue officials, he created multiple levels of supervision. The officers known as amils collected the taxes, while inspectors reported directly to the Sultan. Alauddin himself often reviewed records, punishing even the slightest sign of dishonesty. In one recorded instance, when a tax collector was found guilty of embezzlement, he was publicly dismissed and his property confiscated. To Alauddin, justice and fear went hand in hand. One could not exist without the other. But perhaps the most radical part of his governance was his relationship with the nobility. Before his rule, nobles enjoyed great power. They lived luxuriously, married into each other's families, and often plotted against the throne. Alauddin decided to break this pattern once and for all. He prohibited nobles from forming alliances through marriage, from holding feasts, or from maintaining large private armies. They were required to live modestly and follow strict court discipline. Any noble showing signs of wealth or arrogance risked suspicion. In doing this, Alauddin weakened the aristocracy but strengthened the state. No longer could powerful families challenge the Sultan's authority. He centralized administration to such a degree that every decision, economic, military, or judicial, ultimately passed through him. The Delhi Sultanate became not just a kingdom, but a machine powered by the will of one man. This centralization extended even to the military. He introduced a system of dog, branding horses, and maintaining registers of soldiers to prevent corruption in the army's payroll. Before this system, dishonest officers often claimed pay for imaginary soldiers or substituted inferior horses for good ones. With Alauddin's reforms, every soldier and horse was recorded, inspected, and branded with a royal mark. Pay was issued only after verification. This not only improved efficiency, but also reduced the cost of maintaining a large army. It is remarkable how interconnected Alauddin's reforms were. His price controls ensured cheap food. Cheap food meant lower wages, and lower wages allowed him to maintain a massive army without draining the treasury. His land reforms increased revenue, and his restrictions on nobles prevented rebellion. His intelligence network maintained fear and discipline, ensuring that no one could hide deceit. All these measures combined to make Alauddin's empire one of the most stable and organized states of its time. However, stability came at a cost. The Sultan's methods were harsh, and his rule was marked by fear. Traders complained that profits vanished, peasants struggled under heavy taxes, and nobles lived under constant surveillance. But from Alauddin's perspective, these sacrifices were necessary. He saw himself not as a tyrant, but as a guardian of order in a chaotic world. One must remember that his empire faced continuous external threats. The Mongols, fierce warriors from Central Asia, had destroyed empires far greater than Delhi, yet during Alauddin's reign, they were defeated repeatedly. His military reforms and economic discipline made that possible. When the Mongols attacked near the Ravi River, his armies crushed them. When they invaded once more near Delhi, they were annihilated so completely that they never returned in such strength again. Alauddin's careful financial planning ensured that these wars could be fought without bankrupting the state. Every coin collected from taxes, every sack of grain stored in granaries, every weapon forged in his arsenals, all were part of his grand design for survival. But his rule was not purely practical. There was also philosophy behind it. Alauddin believed that people's behavior could be shaped by their economic circumstances. If prices were stable, they would remain content. If officials were monitored, they would remain honest. If nobles were controlled, they would remain loyal. He tried to build not just a kingdom, but a disciplined society, one where every class, from peasant to prince, knew its limits. His religious policy reflected similar pragmatism. Though he was a Muslim ruler, he avoided the interference of religious leaders in state matters. He respected scholars and clerics, but refused to let them dictate policy. The famous historian Barani records that when some clerics questioned the legality of his actions under Islamic law, Alauddin replied that his concern was governance, not theology. "I am not the caliph," he is said to have declared. "I am a king, and kingship has its own law." This separation of religion from administration was rare in his time and reveals his modern mind. Yet, for all his discipline and rationality, there was a certain loneliness in his rule. His court was quiet, his officials fearful, and his subjects cautious. He inspired obedience, not affection. Unlike later rulers such as Akbar, who sought harmony through tolerance, Alauddin sought strength through control. He was, in essence, a ruler of iron, unbending, efficient, but distant. And yet, his reforms worked. For nearly 2 decades, his system held firm. Prices remained stable, the treasury grew, and rebellions were rare. Foreign observers like the Persian traveler Amir Khusrau admired his governance, writing that under Alauddin's rule, Delhi became one of the most prosperous and secure cities in the world. Even after his death in 1316 CE, the machinery he built continued to function for years. His successors, though weaker, benefited from the stability he had created. Historians have often debated his motives. Was he driven by greed, fear, or wisdom? Perhaps by all three. He was not a visionary dreamer like Muhammad bin Tughlaq, but a realist who understood the value of order. When we study his legacy today, it is tempting to judge him by modern standards. His punishments were severe, his taxes heavy, his surveillance oppressive. But we must remember the world he ruled, a world of endless invasions, fragile loyalties, and fragile crops. In such a time, mercy often meant weakness, and hesitation meant collapse. Alauddin's strength was his understanding that power alone could not sustain an empire. It needed discipline, structure, and economic balance. He was, in many ways, India's first great economic planner. Long before the words inflation, market regulation, or price control were coined, Alauddin understood their meaning through instinct and observation. He realized that an army marches not just on courage, but on grain, that loyalty is not just earned by love, but by stability, and that a ruler's greatest weapon is not the sword, but the system. His reforms, though born from necessity, shaped the very nature of medieval Indian governance. Later, rulers like Sher Shah Suri and Akbar would refine his ideas: centralization, land surveys, price controls, and adapt them to their own reigns. But the seed of those ideas was planted by Alauddin Khilji, the sultan who dared to bring logic into a world ruled by chaos. In the grand sweep of history, he remains one of the few rulers who combined military might with administrative genius. He expanded his empire from Gujarat to Bengal, from Delhi to the Deccan, and yet, unlike many conquerors, he understood that conquest means little without order. The wealth of Gujarat, the tribute of the Deccan, the taxes of the Doab, all flowed smoothly because his system made it possible. It is easy to imagine his court in Delhi, the markets bustling with activity, merchants weighed down with coins, officers moving through narrow lanes, checking prices, the Sultan himself seated in his palace, listening to reports late into the night. Every number, every name, every transaction mattered to him. Nothing was too small to escape his attention. In his mind, every grain of wheat and every coin of copper was a thread in the fabric of empire, and he held all those threads tightly in his hands. Alauddin Khilji's reforms remind us that governance is not only about power, but about foresight. He understood that empires fall not from enemies outside, but from decay within. His measures against corruption, inflation, and rebellion were not acts of cruelty, but acts of preservation. He saw himself as a surgeon cutting away diseased parts to save the body of the state. And though his methods were harsh, they worked for a time. As centuries passed, his name became both admired and feared. Some saw him as a tyrant, others as a genius. But even his harshest critics could not deny his effectiveness. Few rulers in medieval India achieved such control over both sword and coin, both man and market. And so as we look back today, we must ask ourselves, what truly defines a great ruler? Is it conquest and glory, or stability and reform? Is it mercy, or the courage to enforce discipline? Can order be created without fear, or must a strong hand always shape the destiny of nations? Was Alauddin Khilji's rule one of oppression, or was it the price of peace in a world that knew only war? And if history must judge him, should it judge the harshness of his methods or the brilliance of his results? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, in the quiet balance between ambition and restraint, between power and wisdom. Alauddin Khilji was no saint, but he was a ruler who understood the logic of empire better than most. He may have ruled with iron, but through that iron he forged order out of chaos, and that perhaps is his greatest legacy.